Okay, and we are now recording. Just keep that in mind, folks. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome everyone who is currently with us. Like I said, we're going to give it another minute or so to see if anyone else joins us tonight. But for those of you who are here, it's good to see you. And Matt and I will be doing some introductions in just a second. Okay. Well, let me just go ahead and pull my screen share open. We're going to get started. Oh, hang on one second. Another person joining the waiting room. Okay, so we have a couple more people who are currently joining us. Welcome. We haven't gotten started yet, so feel free to just get comfy. We'll be starting in another minute or so. Just gonna see if anyone else joins us. And again, for those of you who are just joining us, we are recording this, so just keep that in mind.
But you are, I don't believe will be showing up on the screen.
Correct? No one is going to be showing up on screen.
Right.
Just wanted to throw that out there that we are going to be recording. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And again, just want to say thank you all so much for those of you who are joining us tonight. My name is Kira Vaughn. I am the Substance Use Prevention Coordinator for City of Somerville, and I am also joined tonight by my coworker, Matt, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Mitchell. I am the Prevention Services Manager with the City of Somerville's Health and Human Services Department in the Somerville Prevention Services Division. So our division focuses primarily on substance misuse prevention for substances such as alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, nicotine, opioids, and recently we started talking about problem gambling a little bit more. So we do a lot of programs and initiatives, particularly with a focus on youth.
Thank you so much. And the topic of tonight's conversation, excuse me, we have a couple more people joining us right now. Yep. So the topic of tonight's training is going to be on something we haven't talked about a whole lot before now. As Matt mentioned, we have kind of traditionally been focused on substance use-based concerns when it comes to addiction. But tonight we also really wanted to shed some light on something that has been popping up more and more and more often, and that would be social media. So to go ahead and just get us started with some basic objectives for tonight, we're going to be talking about some of the practices of social media. Oh, excuse me, I went a little bit far ahead there. And also talking about the impact of social media on mental health and substance use, identity things, especially amongst youth, and also kind of talking about treatment and kind of best practices for managing social media use. So we are actually going to be starting off this training tonight with an Ask the Audience question. So I'm going to pull up right here, which is, what comes to your mind when you think about social media? And if you want to go ahead and please submit your answers to the chat box, that would be fantastic. I'm going to give people a minute or so to submit their answers. Okay, and just as a quick reminder, if you have not already muted yourself, please do so now. Okay, got a couple of different answers coming into the chat box. Thank you all so much. Influencers, yep, definitely social media influencers. We're actually going to be talking about that a little bit further along. TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, yep, absolutely. Seeing Instagram and TikTok again. Absolutely correct. Does anyone else want to throw anything into the chat box in terms of answers? These are all pretty good so far. A way to contact people. Yes, absolutely. Also seeing another answer here, YouTube, staying connected to folks. Yep, so definitely the connection element. insight on other people's lives. Yeah, I really like that one. Absolutely. These are some great answers. Thank you all so much. And I think with that, one more, and that is not always what it seems. Yes, and we are also going to be talking about that as well. And oh yeah, also a platform to share things on. Absolutely. Thank you all so much. Those are some great answers, and that actually is going to nicely take us over to our next slide, which I'm actually going to turn over to Matt. If Matt, you want to come back on.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kara. Those were some great responses in the chat. Kind of hit upon a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about today. But as Kara mentioned, as we started to think about social media and the potential aspects on addiction, we got a lot of questions from folks after they had seen the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. And, if you haven't seen it, it's certainly an interesting watch. There are certainly some aspects of it that you want to take with a grain of salt, particularly, the people featured were those that had an axe to grind with the industry. But there were also some other themes that had come up that I think would be worth definitely more research and definitely more conversation. And one of the standout quotes that had come from it was, there are only two industries that call their customers users: illegal drugs and software. I'm assuming there are more industries that call the people that use their products users. But it was an interesting parallel that I think that was drawn, where a lot of the same things that impact the brain in terms of substance use and impacts the brain similarly in terms of the euphoria and kind of the serotonin, releases and things that make you feel good, and staying connected and feeling like you're part of this network is very important. And so the big thing I think is that, as we saw in the chat box, there is a dilemma where these platforms can be put to very good use, and then there's also aspects of it that sometimes can be harmful. And I think it's just worth noting, and I think it's kind of a good way to think about it as we talk a little bit more about what we're going to be seeing tonight in some of the slides. But it's definitely interesting to see both sides of it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matt. And that actually takes us nicely again over to first question, really in some ways of training. What exactly is social media? I think we're all pretty familiar with the different platforms of social media. A lot of you submitted a lot of answers to the group chat that were like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and I have a couple of other symbols over here to our left in terms of even like LinkedIn, Twitter, WhatsApp, Pinterest. Google technically is an entire social media platform in of its own self. But we also need to think about kind of the larger purpose. And again, a lot of you kind of alluded to this in those answers you submitted. Social media, which we could say is just kind of the act of using these different social media platforms, is really linked heavily to social networking, which means that you're interacting with other people, you are connecting with other people, you're messaging other people. Social media has the word social in it for a really, really good reason. And it is definitely something that has grown and changed ways that I don't think many of us were anticipating, especially those of us who are, not to age myself here, but old enough to remember a life before social media and even, I would say, widespread use of the internet. It's really evolved in just the past 5 years alone, and it's changed dramatically in the past 15 years, and it's going to continue to grow and change the longer that it's in existence, in good ways and in bad ways, I think. But again, we're going to be talking about that a little bit more as we continue moving forward. Now, here's another really interesting question, which is, can social media be addictive? And in terms of the American Psychological Association, which handles a lot of the formal diagnosis of mental health conditions in the United States, technically, when it comes to non-substance related addiction disorders, only gambling actually is considered to be an official diagnosis. Other things like social media use, I would even go so far as to say other things like shopping addiction or, video game addiction. Those are not things that have been formally recognized yet. but I could definitely see that changing at some point, especially because we're doing so much more research on the impact of social media, and especially how it is impacting youth and generations of people who have grown up their entire lives with this huge social media presence on their back, no pun intended, with this image right over here to the right. I would make the argument, as someone who has worked with a lot of non-substance related addiction disorders, that there definitely are some very, very similar qualities to keep in mind. Um, I would say that many things have the potential to be addictive in nature. And I think that that really is something that we see pretty clearly when it comes to negative outcomes of use. And definitely we are going to be talking about that a lot more during the rest of this presentation, but just something to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, and one thing, if I can just add one thing to that slide. One thing that I think is talked about in the documentary I kind of talked about earlier was the fact that these platforms are really designed to keep you coming back. They're basically building algorithms and formulas to encourage you to stay on their app as long as you can. And I think the other quote that came from it was, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. And for a lot of these social medias, you're not paying for them. And the way that they're supported financially is through advertisements. And so their model is that they're really trying to keep you scrolling, pun intended there, on their app as much as possible. So you see something like, if you've ever been on Facebook or Instagram, when you scroll down, maybe you've reached the end of your timeline. When you scroll down, something new pops up every time. That's actually a strategy of theirs to keep you coming back. It's kind of tricking you in some ways to think, oh, maybe new content is there. And it's like, no, just the new thing is at the top. And then maybe the other stuff that you've already seen is already down below. And so when we think about can it be addictive? I think some of it by nature and by the way that they're really designed to keep you engaged is in some ways promoting that.
Yeah. Actually, I also have someone else in the audience who is raising their hand at the moment. Alicia, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, about like the one that like it's kind of addicting. So a bunch of like corporations use like algorithms to like find out what people don't like and like start kind of like putting to pieces like if we show them this, how are they gonna react? And this to like kind of like slowly but like to start making you like only see things that you only want to see. So that could like make you more addicted to only seeing like this certain part of the internet or that.
Very good point. And absolutely, I think especially if a lot of the newer apps that are kind of out there, especially TikTok, I have a lot of clients who tell me about how nuanced their TikTok accounts are in terms of the content that is kind of shown to them. And it really is, like you said, it's all based on these really, really interesting algorithms. You might look up something once and then all of a sudden you're inundated with posts, say around like corgi puppies for like the next 3 months, all just because maybe you clicked a like on like one picture. And it's, as Matt also pointed out, there's just so much promotion that's going behind a lot of these algorithms, like you were mentioning. So absolutely, it is all built in to kind of get us to keep coming back to what the algorithms think we're going to be responding the most to. So absolutely, great points from both of you. Thank you so much. Which also, again, leads us to another really interesting slide here. Like, how does social media potentially impact us? I've kind of broken it down into a couple of different categories here. I think emotionally, there is definitely a huge connection between our emotions and our social media use. Social media, especially after the year that we have just had, it's been one of our main ways of kind of interacting, not just with the people who we know, but also just kind of the world in general. I think a lot of the things that we've seen on social media, they've made us feel a variety of different emotions, ranging from excitement to dread, to happiness, to anxiety and depression, anger to, boredom. There's so many different ways that social media impact us depending on the content that we're seeing. And that also in turn is very closely connected to how it impacts us mentally. I think a lot of us, and I include myself in this, have turned to social media more than ever in the past year, just because of, quite frankly, a lot of the boredom that existed at certain parts of the pandemic, especially during the first really tight initial phase of the lockdown. Um, that being said, I also want to point out that there are also a lot of things about social media that can lead us to feeling more creative, that are leading us to maybe feeling more motivated or inspired. But the flip side again to that would be even just being super, super distracted, and I think especially with some of the younger individuals who I've been speaking to during the past couple of months and doing remote learning, that distraction of social media is something that is even more complicated now when people are stuck at home than it would have been, a year and a half ago when people were actually still learning in school in person, and maybe there are stricter guidelines around not having your phone out. Physically, also, there can be some interesting effects here, maybe not quite as noticeable as the emotional and mental ones at first, but I think one of the big things that I, as a healthcare person, am kind of concerned about is just the sedentary lifestyle sometimes, where you're literally lying on your couch or your bed or on the floor and just constantly being on your phone and just flipping through it for hours. That can also lead to a lot of changes to your ability to focus on things, to remember things, your ability to even like sleep because of all the blue light entering your eyes. There's also some interesting research to show that a lot of chemicals in the brain get released when you're viewing social media. And that especially would be dopamine, which is normally a chemical that is kind of what we consider like a feel-good chemical. So that in turn is very similar to substance use-based addictions in the sense that you're feeling this really good wave of emotion or energy crashing over you when you're engaging with social media and maybe a substance. And it just kind of keeps you coming back for more. That's one of the things that really connects us positively to social media use, as Matt so well pointed out earlier. And finally, I think it would be remiss of me not to point out just like the human connection aspect of this too. Social media has been one of the things that has allowed us to connect with one another at a time, especially right now, where we have been separated from the people we normally have in our lives, and with that comes our ability to maintain communication with people, to maintain relationships with other people. And that in turn has been a really incredible thing, I think, especially in light of a lot of the cultural moments that have happened in the past year or so, in terms of Black Lives Matter, in terms of the most recent Asian American Pacific Islander violence incidents. It's been a really wonderful force for change. However, again, there's always a flip side to things. There's also a lot of research to indicate that social media can also kind of, in some ways, isolate us from other people because it becomes our main form of communicating with others, and it kind of almost puts us into this little isolated bubble, so to speak. And that in turn can also lead to some not so great interactions. We have unfortunately seen a huge increase in a lot of really negative online and social media dialogue, especially with all of the political things that have been popping up in the past year or so. And even without that particular example, I think, there are so many incidents that we have seen in terms of, online cyberbullying, to just a whole lot of commentary where people aren't maybe comparing themselves to this kind of very romanticized ideal of who they should be or what they should look like, et cetera, et cetera. And again, we're going to go into a little bit more detail about all of that a little later on. But in short, social media has a tremendous amount of impact and power over us and over our lives. And I think that that is not going to be changing anytime soon. So I also wanted to talk specifically a little now about the impact of social media on youth. And this is, again, a pretty complex topic at the moment. I mentioned cyberbullying being an issue in the last slide. And I think also mental health is something that we can't ignore either. We talked a little bit about that in the last slide as well, but I definitely will also argue that mental health can be extremely impacted in young people, depending on what content they're absorbing, the cultural things that they're being exposed to. I've given a couple of specific examples here. For instance, there are so many unrealistic examples and ideas around body image and body standards and stereotypes around bodies. And that is both in terms of promotion, it's in terms of advertisements, it's also in terms of just kind of the influencers. And I think with that, you also in some ways have a lot of exposure to inappropriate content and marketing, where I have done a lot of work with youth in the last couple of years, and it's always shocking to me where I'll be working with someone who's maybe 12, 13 years old, and they're already kind of putting this expectation on themselves that they need to look like Kim Kardashian or they need to look like Chris Hemsworth. And I'm like, you're 12 years old. You are not physically at that point in your life where you are going to have that sort of body. It's just literally physically and genetically impossible. And yet this is kind of just some of the promoting content that is really being shoved in our faces 24/7, and it's really hard to get away from. I would also apply that to cyberbullying as well, because when it comes to maybe in-person bullying, you might be able to find ways of getting away from that. Like instead of, whether that be, finding a safe place to get away from bullying or being able to maybe have some sort of like healthier kind of mediation situation between you, the other person involved, and maybe an adult. Cyberbullying is literally in your face all the time. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of impossible to get away from, even if you were to do things like blocking, et cetera, et cetera. Matt, I noticed that you had raised your hand. Is there something you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I wanted to touch base a little bit on the influencer comment you had made. And I also saw Alicio in the chat said, agree, having unrealistic expectations.
Yeah,
and
I just see that now. Yeah.
I had a training, was it last month now, on behavioral addictions and kind of how they are advertised or out there in the community and many different platforms. And for the influencer piece, I always find it very interesting because the products themselves or the industry themselves, they really go to far lengths to try to make it feel like the people who are using the products are as genuinely using the products, like as if they just have it as part of their lives versus paying them to promote the product. So like one of them that comes up, and I'm sure the youth on the call or the video today would agree, Charlie D'Amelio, a big influencer, I think #1 TikTok person. It's been well known that she's big on Dunkin' Donuts, and she often has Dunkin' Donuts coffees in her TikToks. And there's like did she like Dunkin' Donuts? And then Dunkin' Donuts came to her and said, hey, we'll pay you to promote it. Or did Dunkin' Donuts come to her and say, hey, we're going to pay you to promote this? And then she started putting the Dunkin' Donuts in her in her videos. And the interesting there is like, again, we're not talking specifically like a substance like alcohol or marijuana, but we're talking about caffeine, which also has very similar effects, on the body, as we've kind of talked about with some of these things. And it's just so interesting to see how ingrained a lot of these advertisements are. It's kind of like the new age product placement, versus you used to see like a certain brand of something in a TV show, which you still do. And even some of the research I've seen, these products are now, if you watch like a movie or something, at the beginning, it may say something like, there's product placement in this, which is a big step up from what used to be, where you just didn't know whether or not the person was paid to use this product or not. And it's just interesting. So like now, every time I see some type of a product in a video, I'm always like, all right, are they getting paid for that? Or are they genuine? And I feel like I'm usually going to be on the side of they're getting paid for it some way, shape, or form. Because if they weren't getting paid for it, it would just be a generic, coffee cup that didn't have any logo on it, or a soda can that didn't have any real company on there. So it's just interesting how some of these things appear, and then not understanding, I think, fully on the industry's end of like how it can have such negative impacts on youth. And, we talk a lot about tobacco companies being exposed for them really trying to say we need to get younger youth or addicted to our substances essentially so that we can have lifelong users. And I wonder if there's any parallels there between tobacco industry tactics and maybe some of these other larger products and their industry tactics. So
Absolutely. Definitely some very, very good points. And it's also even making me think, and this is not exactly social media related, but I think about all of the, I guess actually kind of is, like I think about like even just like YouTube, for instance, and me watching a video and it being interrupted a few times just to display advertisements. And I keep remembering seeing all of these recent ones about medications or like some sort of like medical procedure, and how it always starts off with like, oh, this has been recommended by all of these dermatologists or medical practitioners or whoever, and me thinking to myself, well, you know, are you paying them to say that? So kind of along the lines of what you were just saying, Matt. And knowing that, you know, I think with as someone who has actually, you know, been given lunches and like things by, you know, pharmaceutical reps in the past when I was still working in more traditional healthcare, yeah, it's all about you kind of that monetary promotion, and it really it makes it very tricky because you have a lot of people who are probably thinking, oh, this person probably really genuinely loves this product. That's so amazing. I'm going to go out and now use it. And it gets pretty sticky. Definitely gets very sticky. And we will continue to have to think about that, I think. But to kind of bring the topic of conversation back to cyberbullying a little bit more, I would say overall, cyberbullying is definitely on the rise. I don't think that this is news to a whole lot of other people. But I would say for what it's worth, it might be interesting to talk about kind of classic cyberbullying versus passive cyberbullying. And I'm actually going to turn back to our audience since we do have a couple of youth, I believe, in our audience tonight. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to the difference between classic versus passive cyberbullying? And I'll just let people kind of submit their answers into the chat box if you're interested. I'm getting a couple of things coming into the chat box right now. Face-to-face versus texting. Okay, yeah, that's one definite way of looking at it. Someone else is saying here, classic could be maybe just once and passive could be continuous. Okay, yeah, potentially. Anyone else want to throw anything into the chat box? Okay. Well, if anyone else wants to throw anything in there, please go ahead and do so. I'm going to keep the chat box open on my screen just to see if anything else comes in. Oh, and here we go. Posts that have unintended consequences. Yeah, that's another interesting one. Oh, and we have one more here. People can say meaner stuff because they're not in person and they don't need to reveal their face. Oh, that is another really interesting thing to mention about cyberbullying. Absolutely. When it comes to classic cyberbullying, I think these kind of tend to be the more obvious examples of bullying. It's just happening through a screen. And you may or may not be able to know who that other person's identity is, as was pointed out so well by Alicio. Thank you so much. And that could be everything from leaving really derogatory commentary on someone's social media accounts or posts to, you know, even sending like just direct messages or instant messages to someone with a pretty, you know, I would say language on a pretty negative tone. And then there's this idea around more passive cyberbullying. And I think that this could look like a couple of different things. I would say it probably is a little bit less apparent at times in the sense that passive cyberbullying could look more along the lines of, say, maybe leaving a lot of dislikes on someone's posts or, you know, sharing certain things, you know, in kind of, you know, I would say smaller group chats and really, you know, kind of using some disparaging language, or, unfriending someone and, getting a whole lot of other people to also unfriend another person. So definitely there's a lot of nuance to this, and I would say it probably is going to depend on the situation, but both can have some pretty negative results and consequences attached to them. As of, I would say, the last middle school Somerville Health survey that we administered to our students, I'd say that about 9% of middle school students in Somerville have reported being cyberbullied. And at the high school level, that number goes up to about 12% as of 2020. I would be interested to see if there have been any changes with those numbers, just based on the fact that obviously we have all been spending a lot more time on our social media at home in this past year, but we're just going to have to kind of wait and see if there have been any changes in the next kind of rounds of health surveys that we submit out in the next couple of years. But it definitely, with these numbers being what they are, it definitely seems to indicate that cyberbullying is well and alive in Somerville youth culture. And that being said, I think it's also something that we've been doing our best to try and bring a little bit more awareness to, as evidenced in the fact that, as we can see here, there's definitely been a bit of a decline in the number of people who are reporting being bullied electronically, especially at the high school level. So, with that being said, now we're going to start talking a little bit more about not exactly treatment, but more what I'm going to call healthy social media use. I think the best way to break this down would be breaking social media use down into routine social media use and unhealthy social media use. And again, just because we've gotten so many great audience questions tonight, I do want to open this back up to the chat box here. Anyone want to contribute to what they think a routine versus unhealthy social media use example might look like? And again, I'm just going to let people submit their answers into the chat box. Okay, we're starting to see some answers come in here. So let me just see here. Routine social media use could be checking occasionally just to stay connected to people. Yeah, absolutely. Another example of routine social media use, controlled amount of time to use social media use, whereas unhealthy is continuous use. Yeah, okay. Unhealthy social media use, checking it frequently to the point that it is impacting other areas of your life. Absolutely. Okay. Anyone else want to throw any things into the chat box? Using it to elevate negative information. Absolutely. And someone else here saying staying up all night and not sleeping or missing school because you just want to keep scrolling. Absolutely. Definitely. We have been seeing an increase with that as well. And someone also said in terms of unhealthy social media use, misinformation. Absolutely. So thank you all so much. Another round of really, really great answers. To not add too much here, because honestly, you all did a great job just now, but we tend to think of routine social media use as being pretty normal and just kind of doing the occasional check-in, a normal level of responding to content and to posts and messages. Whereas unhealthy social media use, we tend to think of as being quite problematic in the sense that it's having a very negative effect on your life. And there are a couple of different things that I definitely hear about all the time. I think one of the big ones is FOMO, which breaks down into fear of missing out. And as Matt and Alicio mentioned very earlier on in this presentation, that kind of constant scrolling and waiting for things to be updated with new content. I think a lot of that is definitely connected to this big fear of missing out, that if you're just not checking your social media all the time, you're going to miss some new big thing that comes out. I would say that there, again, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of judgment and a lot of self-comparison tends to happen with unhealthy social media use. There's also a big chance that you might just feel really disconnected to other people without the use of social media use. And as again, a few other people have also noted that it could have a definite impact on your ability to stay focused in school, or maybe I would even say for adults, it could be not being able to stay focused on work. So it's to the point where it's having some pretty negative effects on your ability to live your normal daily life. So thank you again so much for everyone who submitted answers to the chat box just now. So treatment, let's talk about that for a second. Like I said, this is not technically a formal diagnosis in anyone's books yet, so there's really technically no formal treatment for social media misuse. However, that doesn't mean that people are entirely without options. Treating social media misuse with the same techniques that we use to treat substance use-based disorders might actually be pretty helpful. So for those in our audience who maybe are not super familiar with what those techniques might be, we tend to use quite a lot of what we call cognitive behavioral therapy when it comes to substance use treatment, meaning that you are identifying a problem in a person's life, and then you are coming up with a very specific plan of action for trying to change that behavior. So for instance, if I'm working with, just to kind of keep this a little more relevant here, if I'm working with a youth who is struggling with, let's say a kind of a combination of social media misuse and video game misuse, then a good CBT plan I might come up with this person is, coming up with a very strict plan of, okay, I'm only going to spend this much time on social media, and I'm only going to spend this much time playing video games in the course of the day. I am only going to allow myself to connect with people on these certain types of platforms, or I have a goal that in 3 months, I want to eventually delete my Discord account. Things that are very, very specifically based around slowly making that behavioral change happen. I would say also that this is something that really gets kind of tailored and custom made to the individual person. It really is really dependent on what is going to work for that person. And a lot of it is just kind of having to have some more healthy boundaries put up in place and kind of understanding what's driving me towards this misuse. If I am working with, again, that same use that I used in that example just now of someone who is struggling with social media misuse and video game misuse, then something that we might want to also focus on would be kind of understanding what led them to that point, because you don't just pop into existence in the universe and all of a sudden you're having all of these difficulties. These are things that tend to build up over time. And we kind of have to go back to the beginning and kind of figure out, well, what led up to this? What's feeding it now? What can we do about it? That also leads to another really interesting point, as Matt just reminded me about in our chat, which is this whole concept around something called harm reduction. When it comes to social media, for instance, it's pretty impossible to escape social media at this point. Not just because it's all around us all the time, but just also because, like, frankly, even social media use has even really impacted everything from school to work. We're all using Zoom, a social media platform, to have this training right now in this moment. I definitely also have to connect with people through Google, or I have to be looking at different resources on the internet. I am connected to a lot of different resource groups through Facebook and Instagram of trying to get more resources for clients. We can't really necessarily escape from this unless you literally go to an island in the middle of nowhere that has no access to internet whatsoever. Unless you do that, you're not really going to be able to get away from this. And in that case, what we're looking at here is maybe not stopping all of your social media use completely, because frankly, that's just not a super realistic expectation for most people these days. But it's all about harm reduction. It's all about reducing the negative misuse and trying to get it back within those healthy boundaries. And again, as I said earlier, CBT can be really helpful for that, and other types of different therapies can be super helpful for that as well. There's also this really interesting article that I found where a group of scientists actually trained a large group of pediatricians in Canada to talk more openly with their patients about, well, how much time are you spending on your social media and how do you think that it's impacting you? And the really interesting thing that that study found in 2018 was that, you know, the more of the pediatricians talked openly about it with their young patients, the more the young patients actually opened up and talked to their medical providers and other adults about maybe concerns that they were having with their social media use. So I think another really important aspect of the conversation that I want to bring to the table tonight is also, we also just frankly, we just need to talk about this more. It's such an embedded part of our culture now that I think sometimes we don't realize how normalized we've made some of these things. And some of these things are quite frankly pretty unhealthy. So I think the more conversation that we have around this, the better off that we are going to be in terms of getting social media back into some healthier spaces for all of us. And, you know, also, I think, again, as someone just reminded to me privately in the chat, there's also, it can be quite difficult to have this conversation just because of a lot of the stigma and stereotyping that exists around talking to other people about problems that we might be having. I would say that social media misuse maybe doesn't have the level of stigma and stereotyping behind it as, say, opioid abuse does, but it's still difficult to have these conversations in our culture. And I hope that we continue to just make that more and more and more normalized as we move forward into the future. In terms of some best practices, I would say, again, let's continue to have conversation. Let's continue to just have really supportive open spaces where people can talk about a lot of what's going on with their social media use. Again, setting time limits, which could be maybe I'm only going to spend, you know, half an hour on social media in the morning, 15 minutes at lunch, maybe another 20 minutes at the very end of the day. I would also say it's really important to be very intentional with your social media. I know, for instance, that one of the things that I have really tried to do in the course of the pandemic, when I found my social media use going through the roof for the first time really in my life, is trying to be really mindful about who I was following and the sort of content that I was being exposed to. To give a kind of a humorous example here, YouTube, for instance, I definitely follow a lot of different individuals on YouTube. But I really have made a point to try and stay away from a lot of the very drama-filled channels, or the ones that seem to attract quite a bit of negative media attention. So my YouTube channel is mostly made up of dog rescue videos and, you know, random bits of history narratives. So definitely avoiding kind of some negative spaces just by staying in kind of some of the smaller and lesser known social media accounts. And that has been very helpful for me. I would also say, please don't compare yourself to others. We have a very good example of that at the very end, pretty much the last slide of this presentation, which we'll go into a little bit more. But it is a Wild West show in terms of the social media world. And so much of what we see and so much of what we compare ourselves to is just either A, completely fake, or B, it's been highly, highly edited. Something that I remind people a lot about, especially my clients who are in their teens or are youth or are even like young college-aged adults, is that we only put on social media what we want other people to see. You know, I remember this one newspaper article I read a couple of years ago about this young social media influencer who previously was on Instagram and I think has since deleted her account, talking about how for like every glamorous picture of her on a beach somewhere was her making her friends take like over 50 pictures of her in that same spot in different poses before she was actually happy with the end result. And that really kind of takes away from the joy of that moment in a lot of ways. So I would say, again, a lot of what we're comparing ourselves to is very, very staged. It's very, very edited. And it's just frankly not always very real or authentic. And again, like I had mentioned earlier, also avoid negative or triggering accounts. And that really, again, depends on the individual. But I would just say, be very intentional with who you're following or what you are potentially exposing yourself to. And that definitely can be quite helpful. I'm not saying that we all need to only have like cute puppies and rainbows and unicorns floating in our social media accounts, because that's not, again, very realistic. But I would say if you start to notice that maybe there's someone who you're following online and maybe they're starting to become a not so welcoming or safe place for you, then I would say take a break, or maybe even just think about, stop following that person on their social media accounts entirely, whatever it is that makes the most sense for you. And finally, in summary, as I was pointing out earlier, again, so much of what we see is not real. I would be very interested to know how he managed to get that little pile of sand in his yard, but great example. That's also here's another example on the right now of something that I was seeing on trending, I think probably about 2 years ago, especially now, of people coming up with some, I will admit, very creative ways to make it seem as though they were actually on vacation, not just like in Paris, for instance, but really any one of the popular tourist destinations that have like millions of photos of it online. So again, everything is staged in some way or another, and we just kind of need to keep that in mind. I would also say, because I feel like just looking at my notes, there is something else I've forgotten to mention a little bit earlier. With all of this self-comparison and with all of these different expectations that are being put on us, all the different promotions and advertisements that are being put on us, it is so easy to feel really anxious and or depressed engaging in social media. I think some of the examples I have heard that are kind of more on the anxiety side of things would be, I have one person who is a client of mine who is kind of more in the college age group, who has throughout the pandemic felt incredibly self-conscious about what they've been seeing on their friends' social media posts and thinking, well, I'm not doing any of those things. That must mean I'm really failing at this. And having to we've had to do a lot of work on kind of recognizing, again, some of the privilege and the unhelpful self-comparison that is going on there. And then again, the same thing can really be applied to depression as well. I have worked with a lot of people who have felt very depressed when it comes to everything from, the number of followers that they don't have to like all of my, media ads are reminding me that I don't have the body that I want, or I don't have the baby that I want, or I don't have a relationship like everybody else seems to have. And it's quite easy to really just fall into that slump. And again, all of these ads are being targeted at you in a way that is almost kind of similar to like it's a very strategically planned warfare plan in some ways, in terms of a lot of companies that are kind of trying to target these messages at you. And a lot of it is also societal messaging, as I had mentioned earlier. So basically, in summary, it's all nonsense. Be healthier with it, and just keep in mind that, again, a lot of this is really being directed at you to make you feel a certain type of way, and you don't have to feel that way, because again, social media is a tool just like any other. It can be used for good. It can also be used for bad. And we can be healthy in terms of our use of it. And, sometimes we're going to maybe struggle a little bit with it, but it does not have to be the thing that defines you, your life, or your identity in any way that you are not comfortable with. And now, having gone on that little rant at the end of this, I think we are now going to move into Q&A time. So if anyone would like to speak up or submit a question in the chat box, we are more than happy to answer whatever it is that you would like to ask about. So. I'm seeing something coming in the chat box here. What can I do to limit my screen time? That's a really great question. I would say, first of all, you probably also want to do some thinking about what exactly your screen time is consisting of. For some people, it might be a lot of very visual stuff or video-based platforms like TikTok or YouTube. For other people, it might be Facebook scrolling. For other people, it might be Instagram scrolling. So I would first kind of think to yourself, what is it exactly that is making up the majority of my screen time? Then you kind of want to think to yourself, well, why am I actually engaging with this? For instance, maybe you are on TikTok a lot because, that's just where all of your friends are posting these little quick videos about their lives and you want to stay connected to them. Or maybe you are following someone or a lot of other people, actually, for instance, on Instagram. And you're doing that because you follow a lot of like maybe influencers and you're kind of wanting to see what's going on with their lives. And maybe, quite frankly, some of it is even just like straight up boredom. So, depending on what that situation is looking like for you, I would say there are plenty of other ways in which you can engage with your friends that maybe don't involve as much screen time. I know that we are living in a very digital age, but quite frankly, I still like a good old fashioned phone call every once in a while. Maybe that's me aging myself a little bit here, but it can be really amazing to actually hear another human voice, especially right now where we are so isolated from one another. And if that's not your jam, because again, I realize I'm speaking to a much younger audience, I would also say, again, limit your screen time in a way that makes the most sense for you. Maybe you can kind of limit you talking to your friends, say, only during certain times of the afternoon after school. Or maybe you want to jump in for like 10, 15 minutes at lunchtime, just kind of check in and see how people are doing in the middle of the day. But then really just kind of trying to limit yourself to those times. Something else that I have found super helpful to kind of help me with that, because I've also struggled with that in the pandemic, is I will actually do my work in a certain room in my house, and I will leave my phone and all of my other little electronic devices charging in, say, my bedroom or, somewhere in my kitchen, somewhere that is like, I can't just like grab it and pick it up. So sometimes even doing little things like that can kind of be a good way to trick your brain. Obviously, if you are a student, then, it's kind of hard to get away from the computer right now. And if you're a working adult, same thing. But at the very least, I do think phones can be the big culprits here. So trying to keep some level of separation there might be a good idea as well. Also at night, because nighttime social media and phone and internet use can be quite a big problem. My trick is I actually leave my phone charging outside of my bedroom. Like I have it just close enough that I can hear my alarm going off in the morning, but not so close that I don't have to just like reach over and grab my phone if I want it. I have to leave me, and we need some distance at nighttime. And I've kind of been trying to keep myself on like a timed routine with that, where like 10 o'clock at night, for instance, that is always the time at which I put my phone down, plug it into charge, and then just like walk away and just get into bed and do something else. And that could be everything from knitting to reading a book to, doing whatever it is that I might find to be relaxing. So hopefully those are some helpful tidbits, but I would say again, most importantly, just do what makes the most sense for you. And kind of know what your weaknesses are and what your strengths are. Like for me, once I'm in my bed, I don't want to get out of it. And I am very much not afraid to admit that little bit of laziness in terms of my own behavior, but in terms of, it limiting my screen time interaction, it works. So think about some of those things is what I would suggest. Very good question. And again, anyone else have anything that they wanted to either send in the chat box or anything that anyone wants to ask over audio? Okay, I don't think I'm seeing anything coming in, but that was a really great question. Thank you so much to the person who submitted that to me. And I think with that, just to kind of wrap things up here, Matt, I know that you had wanted to take over this next section, I think.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that, we've been doing a series of these now for a couple months, and want to make sure that, a lot of staff on our end inform these conversations and are doing a lot of work behind the scenes that I would say not everybody knows of all too often. So, you have myself, you have Lovely, you have Bonnie, and you have Kara, who we all work in our own little ways to address substance use prevention, misuse prevention, I should say, and are continuously looking for new avenues, new content that we should consider. And I know, we have the luxury here in Somerville of having our Somerville Positive Forces youth, some of which are here with us today, who inform a lot of this work and really are the main individuals we go to get some of this information. Like Kara was saying, we date ourselves pretty quickly with some of our references. And, we fully acknowledge how difficult it can be for us to just say things like, oh yeah, just put your phone in the other room, or just do this. Cause it's not something that I think a lot of people could just do. And I think it's really important to think about the harm reduction techniques that Kira mentioned. And it's going to be a bumpy road, especially if you're somebody that may be feeling like your use has been impacting some areas of your life. It takes a while to get to a point to be like, okay, I'm going to make a change here. You're going to have, some stumbles. You may go backwards a little bit before you go forward. It's not a straight line in any way. So, if you're feeling like you may need any support or anything, you could certainly reach out to any of us, and, reach out to maybe your family or, medical providers, whoever it may be that you feel most comfortable talking to. And that's a big thing that we really want to highlight and emphasize. So, along with that, as much as we sit here and we talk about all of the pros and cons of social media, we want you to follow us on social media. And I guess the only thing I would say for us is that we'd like to think that the content that we're putting up there is healthy content for people to consume and informative and kind of helps individuals make good decisions, and maybe not even make good decisions, but just make decisions that work for them. No judgment, whether it's good or bad. What may be good for me may be not so good for you. So, we want to make sure that people know what information's out there, what are the facts, especially in a world where we live in a lot of misinformation. And we like to think that our social media platforms provide a lot of that factual, actual news, actual information you should look at. So we have our YouTube page. Just type in City of Somerville Prevention Services, Facebook page at /Somerville Cares, Instagram at Somerville Prevention. And I don't even think we have a Twitter anymore, so you can
Yeah,
probably
we don't ignore the Twitter one. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that was in there. We need to take that out. We do not use that account anymore.
But our Facebook and our Instagram and our YouTube, our main accounts, this is where this YouTube will be uploaded. This video will be uploaded on YouTube after. But, we try and post mindfully, and we try to post, things that are going to be helpful to people. So I thank you for coming tonight. I hope you learned a lot. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us after.
Yeah. I also wanted to kind of hop on that and just say again, thank you all so much for being here tonight. It was so great to hear so many voices in our chat box. And I will say I am realizing I did not put, I put our kind of social media account information out there, and you now all know what our lovely faces look like. But we didn't really leave any personal contact information. So I am actually going to go into the chat box right now. And I think I see a lot of names and faces that I know tonight. I'm very grateful for that, but I'm going to go ahead and put my email out into the chat box right now. And if anyone ever has any questions, you are more than welcome to reach out to me. If you did not already pick up on this, I am a licensed mental health and substance use therapist, so I am always happy to answer any questions that might come my way. If you are a minor, please talk to your parent first. Thank you. I do not want to get in trouble with the law. And on that note, these next two slides are basically just some of the references that we had used today. I'm going to leave them up for about 10 seconds each page, just so people in the video who are looking at this in the future, hello, by the way, can kind of get a sense of what we've been looking at. Feel free to screenshot these if you are doing that. But on that note, again, thank you all so much for being here. For those of you who are watching in the future on this video, my email is kvaughan@somervillema.gov. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. And again, just want to say thank you all so much. It was really great talking to you tonight. And please feel free to, again, reach out if you need anything from us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
That was good. That was good. That was good. I liked it. I liked it. I liked it. I liked it a lot.
Great. I'm so glad. Okay, we're actually gonna.
All right. All right.